If you live in Georgia and you think cannabis should be legal, you are not alone. I personally went around my district with a petition to legalize, and I got a lot more signatures than I got rejections. I had a chance to sit down with Senator Curt Thompson, and he's the lone sponsor of a legalization bill a couple of years ago, and he's very well informed about the issue. Thanks for taking the time out to meet with me today.
Sure.
Cannabis legalization is a big issue in America, and attitudes are changing. I understand that you introduced legislation a few years back that would legalize cannabis recreationally and for medical use.
Well, I introduced a bill that would have gone to a full medical marijuana set up by statute, and similar to what Arizona has essentially. There are bits and pieces we may have pulled from somewhere else, but the base of it was from Arizona. And then we also proposed a statewide referendum, similar to what Colorado did and what most of the other states that have done, that have gone to full retail cannabis systems, to let the voters decide on whether or not to go to a full legalization system. And then I think we did introduce a companion bill. If we didn't do it 2 years ago when we introduced those, we did introduce it this year, the companion bill, which would have been what's called the enacting legislation. This is what it's gonna look like if you approve the referendum. And so those were the three pieces of legislation. And so they were introduced 2 years ago, and then they were updated and reintroduced this past year, because every 2 years you have to update all your bills if you're going to continue pursuing them.
Okay. And as far as today in Georgia, there's legalized medical cannabis oil. And what are the laws today as far as oil, flower, what's legal, what's illegal?
So the only thing that is legal is CBD oil at this point, up to, I think it's a 1% THC level and a 5% CBD level. We did pass a statute this year, reconfirming those levels, as well as adding a list of some illnesses to the list of illnesses that qualify for people to be able to possess CBD oil in those strengths without fear of prosecution. And so I guess the original bill that was passed, 2 years ago, had a shorter list of illnesses, and and some lack of clarity on the THC level. This raised the THC level, raised the CBD level, increased the number of illnesses. But there's still nothing else is legal. So we're one of a few of the 28 states that, if you look, depending on who you Google, you'll see that there are 28 states that have some form of medicinal marijuana. If you look at a list that has Georgia on that list, there's probably 5 or 6 of those states actually are CBD oil only, similar to, I think Georgia is one, I believe Alabama is one. They're mostly in the deep south.
And are there any other senators in Georgia who endorsed or co-sponsored your legislation?
Did not have any co-sponsors for the first bill 2 years ago. Don't have any this year yet, although I think I might get some signers this time. We wanted to go ahead and get it in. Well, that doesn't mean you don't have any supporters. You do. I know that, and different people have done different things. I know that there are decriminalization bills. For instance, State Senator Harold Jones out in Augusta introduced a bill that would have raised the legal limit to change. That would have changed from, I think, 1 ounce to 2 ounce, the legal limit at which you would be charged with intent to distribute, and it would make the 2 ounces and under a misdemeanor only, to try and sort of deal with at least some of a partial decriminalization, I guess is what you would call that. And then you certainly have, State Senator Fort, as part of his campaign to become mayor of Atlanta, has proposed a decriminalization bill for the city of Atlanta, similar to what the city of Clarkston did. I mean, Clarkston's a much tinier city, but you get the same idea, where basically it would take city law enforcement out of the marijuana prosecution business. That would become a county or state issue, but they would stop issuing criminal citations for it.
As far as Clarkston, Georgia, I know Ted Terry the mayor of
Terry.
Clarkston. Yeah, he came out in support of stopping criminal prosecutions for cannabis and making it more similar to a ticket or a civil offense.
Similar to what New York State has.
Right. Have you been in contact with him or?
Yeah, we know each other. We're friends. So I mean, most of us know each other. A lot of us showed up, but there were some recent, I guess, rallies held on April 20th, which has sort of become a day of civic action, protest, and picnics around the reform of various state marijuana laws. And I know that 2 years ago, for instance, I was the only elected official to show up at any of them. And it was nice to see that there was probably 10 or 11 at the events, including Mayor Terry.
Okay.
You know, so I mean, and I'm not saying 10 or 11 is still not as many as you would like, but that's also a huge change in just 2 years in the number of people that are willing to come forward since I first introduced it.
The 2013 report from the American Civil Liberties Union, The War on Marijuana in Black and White, says that black and white people use cannabis at practically identical rates. Do you think marijuana laws are enforced proportionately?
I mean, if you're talking about race, no. I mean, just straight up no. I give many speeches. We talked about it in committees. When I go speak at college classes or high schools in my district or elsewhere, I always, I'm not a very PC person, so I will single out a person of color. And I will say, let me be very clear. My kid gets caught with a joint, cop's gonna send him home with a ticket to get whipped by me, in theory. You get caught with a joint, you go into jail.
Absolutely.
And certainly that's true in Gwinnett County, where my district is. Straight up.
A couple of months.
40% more likely to get arrested for marijuana if you're African American or Latino.
Even on Lawrenceville Swanee Road, there was a young man named Demetrius Hollins who was stomped in the face by the police while he was handcuffed only 2 months ago. These events wouldn't have taken place if cannabis had been legal. He was arrested for marijuana possession.
Right. You're correct, and those two officers, I think, got fired for it. But it's still the very fact that you've created that atmosphere. I do also strongly believe most people. I have no problem with law enforcement. You need it. Okay? Again, it's the best, highest best use of your tax dollars. Do you want folks going after human traffickers? Do you want folks going after armed robbers? Do you want folks going after the guy that, whether it's the rapist or the burglar? Or do you want them going after folks that are using marijuana for personal use? No one, in my opinion, when they say, and I think it's law enforcement is an incredibly noble profession, but when you talk to young people in high school or college that talk about wanting to be a law enforcement officer, or talk about wanting to be a police officer, and wanting to be an FBI agent, a GBI agent, an ATF agent, they never ever say, because I want to go arrest guys at frat parties for having joints, or because I want to knock down doors because grandma has glaucoma and so she has her little stash because it actually makes it hard for her to see her TV shows. Like, these are real stories. That is not a story any person who wants to be a cop tells when they're a kid. That's not what they dream of doing, is pulling people over and writing up reports. The car smelled of marijuana and they were driving slow. Unless you're going to have a tax base to create a police state, it is not the highest best use of your money.
And speaking of grandmothers, here in Atlanta, Katherine Johnston was a 92-year-old grandmother who was killed during a drug raid and had marijuana planted in her home by police. Wouldn't legalization prevent this kind of violence? If
you made marijuana legal, they'd have planted something else in her apartment. Because if you've got a bad cop, you've got a bad cop. I do think that part of criminal justice reform more broadly isn't, there's a bigger picture here when you're trying to change the problem you were talking about racial disparities and how things are enforced. The guy getting stomped in the face, the grandmother, I think she was actually a great grandmother, but she's still a grandmother too. that getting, drugs planted, marijuana planted on her, a bad cop's going to just then plant something else on her. But the problem there is no-knock warrants. The reform of marijuana laws is important to that. It's a piece of that puzzle, and it is not a magic bullet. And it would go a long way to fixing that problem of how the laws are disproportionately enforced. But if you have a cultural bias within your law enforcement community, then that cultural bias will just transfer itself to some other group, some other thing.
As far as the people who argue for only stopping at decriminalization, some say that it should be like a speeding ticket where it's a civil offense, and if you get caught with cannabis in your possession, you should be charged a fine. But speeding may put drivers at risk and other motorists on the road at risk. Does cannabis put people's lives in danger?
I mean, okay, I guess I wouldn't look at it that way. The reason that I don't fault people that support decriminalization, I consider it a step along the way if you can't sort of make the full mental leap yourself yet. The reason you go to full retail, in my opinion, rather than decriminalization doesn't get rid of the drug lords. It doesn't get rid of the gun running. It doesn't get rid of the human trafficking and the use of mules. It doesn't stop people from lacing marijuana. I think that the other side may exaggerate that happening more than it does, but it doesn't not happen. Right. You can get marijuana with X in it. You can get marijuana with almost anything. It doesn't stop the problem of, not the problem, but issues around standardization and things like you need if you're trying to use it as medicine. It doesn't help you deal with issues of needing to standardize it and issues of needing to be able to get it consistently and safely and at a certain quality level. And it doesn't, but most importantly, decriminalization does not solve the drug lord problem, because then all you've done is made it easier for the drug lords to make money. And you've made it harder for essentially Joe or Jane that would rather have a business, or a small-time grower that would rather have their be in the business of farming. They're at a huge disadvantage in a decriminalization system to the drug lords. And I'm not exactly certain why ultimately I would want, as a matter of policy, to adopt a policy that makes it easier on the drug lords. I don't believe that Georgia's second largest cash crop ought to escape taxation.
Governor Nathan Deal's chief of staff have referred to Colorado as a, quote, nightmare. Would you consider the legal economic model in Colorado to be a nightmare?
No, otherwise I would not have proposed a law. The enabling legislation that I proposed more or less takes the Colorado system and adapts it to the Georgia regulatory scheme and the Georgia Department of Revenue, the Georgia Agriculture Department. So we adapted and folded into our system. We are not Colorado, but I'm not going to change every state agency just to have a legalized marijuana system, but you basically use that system. It's actually proven to be remarkably effective. It generates a huge amount of revenue for their school systems, so much so that they are one of the few states now that gives tax rebates. The only other states I think are North Dakota, Texas, North Dakota and Alaska because of the oil industry. Right. And you haven't really seen, there's not been a huge increase in crime, There were some problems in the beginning. You can learn from everybody's mistakes. The problems, but to say there's a nightmare, I've heard people say that too, and I'm like, have you even been to Colorado? Have you been out there? But the mistake wasn't in doing it. But there are always bumps in implementation. That doesn't mean you don't do it.
Currently, there are federal bills in Congress to help end the prohibition of medical cannabis. Should states have the right to make their own medical cannabis laws?
Yes, and it was part of the last The last budget agreement, Omnibus Budget Act of President Obama's legislation said that states that enact medical marijuana laws, that the Justice Department can't use tax dollars to enforce the federal laws. And so it did try to take that out. I would definitely be, if you can't take marijuana off of the drug schedules altogether, if you can just move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, which is I think what some of the bills do. Some of them may take it off altogether, but if you can even just move it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, then you can do medical research. Universities and doctors can do research on the medical side without fear of losing their federal funding at their universities and research institutions. And states are free then to regulate it however they want in terms of as a medicinal product. And it could be something that you could literally be at the CVS pharmacy if they wanted to allow it to be dispensed in that way.
Speaking of federal government, what do you think about Jeff Sessions' message to prosecutors to seek the most harsh sentences they can?
I think that that's obviously a huge step backwards.
So if there are activists in Georgia who oppose cannabis prohibition, what's the best way for them to make their voices heard?
I would say get involved. Get involved at the political level. Find out where your individual state senators and state representatives and U.S. congresspersons and U.S. senators stand on those issues. And then if they don't support you on that issue, consider finding another candidate that is more supportive of either expansion of medical marijuana or reform of marijuana laws broadly in the state. And if you're just never going to be able to bring yourself to vote for a Republican or never going to bring yourself to vote for a Democrat, find someone that is of that in your political party that supports that.
Currently in Georgia now, only the CBD oil is legal. Is that because of some perceived danger of flower or smokable cannabis?
In the minds of those that are opponents, I think there is a fear on their part, sure, whether that's flour or honey or butter or oil or whether it's edibles or smokables or vapes or this, that, and the other thing, and I think the CBD oil, because in theory it's not psychotropic, and it's typically useful only in a small number of illnesses. Useful for treating a small number of illnesses seems to be the first step, or the only step that some on the very far right, the very anti-drug folks, that believe. So sure, I guess they have that fear. I don't think it's based in fact. There's no empirical data to support what they're saying. It's sort of like believing that there's clouds of green haze over Denver and that it's a nightmare out there, when clearly that's said by a person who's never been to the state. It's based on fake news. And it's based on perceptions, based on bad education. That most of folks like myself grew up in the Just Say No. Most folks in the legislature grew up in some front and tail and middle of the Just Say No 80s. Or they're older, and so they were at the height of the sort of war on drugs stuff. If you're coming from the Republican side, and a Republican majority state such as this, and so there's a lot of misinformation out there. There are people that believe Reefer Madness was not a propaganda film, and that they weren't deliberately speeding up how fast the camera was going, and things like that.
As far as people getting access to medical cannabis now, even though the oil has been legalized, how can people get access to this oil?
Well, that's part of the problem, is that we've basically gone to a system where you can have it, no one's going to prosecute you, but you're not supposed to be able to, there's no way to produce it in state because there's no way to grow marijuana in the state legally. And so you're sort of winking and nodding to people who are engaged in trafficking coming across state lines with it. And the risk is that you get caught in another state, somewhere between Colorado and here, I guess, and that doesn't have legalized medical marijuana, or doesn't have legalized marijuana of any form, and so then you get arrested, and you're arrested not just for having it, but for trafficking it, which pretty much in every state is a much more serious offense than probably what you started out trying to do, trying to get something for someone in your, either yourself or someone in your family with a very serious illness.
Even in today's climate in Georgia with the cannabis regulations, Representative Alan Peake is in a situation where he has to skirt regulations just to help people get the treatment that they need.
Right. And it's a shame, and that's why we need changes to the law, and that's why he was trying to change it, that's why I've been trying to change it, that's why others are trying to change it, and hopefully eventually we'll succeed. I mean, the biggest problem there has been getting leadership willing to have these bills come to the floor and a governor willing to sign them.